From $0 to $15.20 million. How a burned junk car changed my life. There's a specific smell that lives in old garages. It's not just motor oil or gasoline, though those are part of it. It's deeper than that. It's decades of metal shavings mixing with concrete dust, ancient grease that seeped into wooden workbenches, the ghost of cigarette smoke during lunch breaks that ended 20 years ago. That smell doesn't wash out. It becomes part of the walls, part of the air itself. I was standing in Grandpa Frank's garage for what I thought might be the last time, and that smell hit me like a punch to the chest. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their usual angry wasp song, casting everything in that cold, clinical white glow that makes every shadow look harder than it should. I'd been putting tools back in their designated spots on the pegboard wall, each outline spray painted in faded yellow, so you know exactly where the half-inch wrench belonged versus the three-quarter. Grandpa Frank had been military precise about his tools. Everything had a place. Everything had a purpose. I'm 32 years old, and I spent most of my adult life with my hands covered in grease and my knuckles scraped raw. I work as a mechanic at Miller's Customs downtown, fixing everything from soccer mom SUVs to the occasional vintage muscle car that some dentist bought to feel young again. It's honest work. It pays my rent on a cramped apartment in the city where the radiator clanks like someone's torturing a xylophone every winter morning. I don't complain. Complaining never fixes an engine. But this garage, this wasn't just any garage. This was Frank's cathedral. My grandfather died 3 months ago. Lung cancer. The kind that moves fast once it decides to move. He was a Korean War vet. The type of man who didn't talk about his service except in fragments, usually after his third beer on a summer evening. Hard as concrete, but fair as a balanced scale. He had this philosophy he'd repeat whenever we worked on something together, usually when I was rushing or getting frustrated with a stubborn bolt. He'd put down whatever tool he was holding, look at me with those steel gray eyes that had seen things I couldn't imagine, and say that things have souls if you put your hands into them, that the difference between junk and treasure wasn't the object itself but the care someone invested in it, that you could tell everything about a man by how he treated the things he owned. I thought about that a lot after he was gone. Frank had lived about 10 minutes from my dad's place, in a modest ranch house with a 2-car garage that he converted into his workshop decades ago. That's where I'd spent most of my teenage summers, learning to gap spark plugs and true brake rotors while he'd grunt approval or shake his head in disappointment. No participation trophies in Frank's garage. You either did it right or you did it again. After he passed, the house went to my father. That was expected. What wasn't expected was how quickly my stepmother Karen moved to colonize every square inch of Frank's memory. Dad had remarried about 7 years ago, after my mom died from complications during what should have been routine surgery. I don't hold the remarriage against him. Grief makes people do desperate things, and he was drowning. But Karen wasn't exactly what you'd call a life preserver, more like an anchor with a good sales pitch. She came with a son from her first marriage, Kyle, 20 years old, supposedly making it big as a day trader, which as far as I could tell, man, he stared at his phone all day watching numbers go up and down while living rent-free in my father's house and driving a leased BMW he couldn't actually afford. The house might have gone to Dad, but the contents of the garage had been specifically left to me in Frank's will. Every tool, every spare part, every coffee can full of mysterious bolts that might be important someday. And the car. Oh, the car. It sat in the center of the garage like some kind of sleeping beast, taking up space that Kyle had apparently decided he needed more. The thing was low and wide, a roadster body with no roof, no doors worth mentioning, and a presence that somehow managed to be both menacing and pathetic at the same time. Frank had bought it sometime in the 80s as what he called a kit car project, basically an unfinished replica that someone had started building in their garage and then given up on, selling it without any real paperwork or documentation. Just a bill of sale that might as well have been written on a napkin. The exterior was entirely covered in black bed liner. Not paint, bed liner. That thick, rubbery, textured coating that people spray into the beds of pickup trucks to protect against scratches and dents. Someone, at some point, had decided to coat the entire body of this car in the stuff. It looked like someone had dipped a sports car in tar and then rolled it in sandpaper. It was ugly, aggressively ugly. The bed liner had gone on thick, obscuring whatever body lines might have existed underneath. It made the whole car look like a rough, black toad squatting in the garage, a lumpy silhouette that seemed to reject light rather than reflect it. People who saw it usually laughed or asked if Frank was planning to finish it someday. He never did. I asked him about it once, maybe 5 years ago, when we were changing the oil in his truck. Why not strip that awful coating off and see what's underneath? Maybe repaint it properly? Frank had given me this look, the kind that suggested I just asked why he didn't try breathing underwater. He said the rubber was probably the only thing holding the fiberglass body together. That kit cars from that era were notorious for having cheap, brittle shells that cracked if you looked at them wrong. The bed liner might look like hell, but it was structural now. It kept the whole thing from falling apart. And anyway, he'd added, the important part was the engine. That much was true. Under the hood sat a legitimate V8, a big block motor that Frank had rebuilt himself. The engine was clean, organized, functional. It would actually run if you wanted it to. But running a car that looked like a Halloween decoration seemed pointless. So it mostly just sat there, a conversation piece that nobody wanted to have a conversation about. I ran my hand along the rough surface of the front fender, feeling the texture catch against my palm. The bed liner was thick, maybe a 1/4 inch in some places. Hard as plastic, but with a slight give to it, like a tire. Somewhere under all this rubber was supposedly fiberglass. Cheap, cracked, $70 sheet fiberglass that would probably disintegrate if you tried to remove the coating. That's what Frank believed. That's what I believed. We were both wrong, but I didn't know that yet. The sound of footsteps on concrete pulled me out of my thoughts. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Karen had a particular way of walking, heels clicking with the kind of aggressive rhythm that announced her presence like a countdown timer. She appeared in the doorway of the garage, backlit by the late afternoon sun, arms crossed in that universal posture of impatient authority. Kyle slouched behind her, phone in hand as always, thumbs scrolling with the dedication of someone mining for digital gold. Karen didn't waste time with pleasantries. She wanted to know when I was planning to remove this eyesore from her garage. Not the garage that had belonged to Frank. Not even the garage that technically belonged to my father. Her garage. Kyle glanced up from his phone, just long enough to add his contribution. He called me a grease monkey, asked when I was hauling away this piece of trash, said he needed the space for his home gym equipment. Or maybe it was for his BMW. The kid changed his story depending on his mood. He was wearing designer sneakers that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and a watch that was definitely fake, but that he treated like it was crafted by Swiss monks. Everything about Kyle screamed borrowed confidence. Karen stepped further into the garage, her heels now loud enough to echo off the concrete floor and metal walls. She informed me, in the tone of someone delivering a court verdict, that I had until tomorrow to clear out. After that, she was calling a scrap service to haul the car away, and she didn't particularly care where it ended up. Probably a landfill, probably crushed into a cube. I should have seen this coming. From the moment Frank's will was read and it became clear that the garage contents were mine, Karen had been circling like a shark that smelled blood in the water. She wanted the space. She wanted to erase any trace of the old man who had probably seen right through her from day one. My father wasn't there. He was never there anymore when it came to these confrontations. He'd become a ghost in his own house, drifting from room to room, nodding along with whatever Karen decided. Grief had hollowed him out, and she'd filled the empty space with her own agenda. I looked at Kyle, really looked at him. This kid who'd never built anything with his own hands, never spent a Saturday covered in engine grime, trying to coax life back into a dying machine. He was scrolling through his phone again, probably checking cryptocurrency prices or whatever fantasy was fueling his delusions of success that week. Then I looked at Karen, who was tapping her foot now, waiting for me to argue or resist so she could escalate this into a scene. I didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I turned back to the car and placed my hand flat against the rough black surface of the door area. The bed liner was warm from the day's heat, the texture catching against my skin like Velcro. Karen said something else behind me, something about how I was being difficult and immature, and how this was exactly the kind of behavior she'd come to expect from someone who couldn't let go of the past. I wasn't listening anymore. I was thinking about Frank's hands. Thick fingers, knuckles swollen from arthritis in his later years, nails that were never quite clean no matter how much he scrubbed. Those hands had built things, fixed things, saved things that other people had given up on. This car was ugly. It was weird. It was probably worthless by any reasonable measure. But it was his. And these people, these parasites who'd moved into his house and were now trying to erase him like he was a stain on their new carpet, they didn't get to decide what happened to it. I made my decision right there. I told them I'd take the car. Tomorrow, first thing in the morning. Karen seemed satisfied with that answer. She probably thought she'd won, that she'd successfully bullied me into compliance. Kyle had already stopped paying attention, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone screen. They left, their footsteps receding back toward the house, leaving me alone with the fluorescent lights and the smell of old oil and the silent beast in the center of the garage. I walked around the car slowly, taking inventory. The body was rough but solid. The tires were flat and cracked from sitting too long. The interior was basic, just 2 bucket seats with worn vinyl, and a steering wheel that looked like it came from a dune buggy kit. No fancy electronics. No power anything. Just mechanical simplicity. The engine, though, that engine was Frank's pride. He'd rebuilt it from a block he'd found at a swap meet, machined the heads himself, balanced everything by hand. It represented hundreds of hours of careful work. I popped the hood and stared at the V8, sitting there in the dim light. Clean, organized, purposeful. This was the part of the car that mattered to Frank. The bones, the heart. Everything else was just packaging. I spent the next hour making a mental checklist of what I'd need to move the car. A flatbed tow truck. Probably. The tires weren't going to roll, and I wasn't about to try dragging it out on rims and risk damaging something. The garage had gotten darker as the sun set outside. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, more isolating. Just me and the tools and the car that nobody wanted. I thought about where I could even put this thing. My apartment had street parking and a landlord who'd probably have an aneurysm if I tried to store a project car on the property. Miller's Customs had some space out back, but I'd have to ask permission, and I wasn't sure I wanted to explain the situation to my boss just yet. I'd figure it out. I always did. What mattered right now was getting this car away from Karen and Kyle before they decided tomorrow was too long to wait. I pulled out my phone and started texting Danny, a buddy who ran a towing service. Asked him if he could do me a favor early morning, flatbed pickup, cash payment. He texted back within minutes. Said he could be there by 7 a.m. Perfect. I looked around the garage one more time, at the pegboard walls with their tool outlines, at the workbench where Frank had taught me how to rebuild a carburetor when I was 16, at the old calendar from 2019, still hanging on the wall, showing a classic Mustang on a desert highway. This place held more memories than my father's entire house. And now it was going to become Kyle's gym, or his gaming room, or whatever other useless thing he decided he needed space for. I walked over to the light switch by the door. My hand hovered there for a moment. The car sat in the shadows now, the overhead lights making its rough black surface look even more alien and strange. It looked like something that had crawled up from underground and decided to take a nap in the middle of a suburban garage. Frank used to say that things have souls if you put your hands into them. I didn't know if I believed that, but I believed that some things deserve better than being crushed into a cube at a scrapyard because they didn't fit someone's aesthetic vision. I believed that memory mattered. I believed that Karen and Kyle didn't get to win this one. I flipped the light switch. The garage went dark except for the faint orange glow from the streetlight outside filtering to the small window near the roof. Tomorrow morning, I'd come back with Danny and his flatbed. We'd load this ugly, weird, black rubber beast onto the truck and haul away to whatever temporary home I could find for it. I didn't know what I was going to do with it long term. I didn't know if it would ever run again or if it would just sit in storage somewhere, another unfinished project gathering dust. But it would be away from here, away from people who saw it as garbage, away from people who saw Frank's life as something to be cleared out and paved over. I pulled the garage door down and locked it, the metal rattling as it settled into place. The night air was cool, and smelled like cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. Somewhere down the street, someone was laughing, probably at a joke I'd never hear. I stood there for a moment in the driveway, keys in my hand, looking at the closed garage door. Tomorrow morning, everything would change. I just didn't know how much. Not yet. I walked to my truck, climbed in, and drove back to my cramped apartment in the city, where the radiator would clank me awake in a few hours, and the coffee would be too strong, and the day would start whether I was ready for it or not. Behind me, in that dark garage, the car waited, silent, patient, keeping its secrets for one more night. The phone call came at 2:37 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was staring at the glowing numbers on my alarm clock, wide awake, unable to sleep because my brain wouldn't stop running through logistics. Where to store the car, how much Danny's towing service would cost, whether I was being stupid for caring this much about a vehicle that looked like it had been rejected from a monster truck rally. When the phone started vibrating on my nightstand, the sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet apartment. I grabbed it without looking at the screen, assuming it was Danny canceling on me or maybe a wrong number. The voice on the other end was my father's, but I almost didn't recognize it. High-pitched, panicked, words tumbling over each other so fast they barely formed sentences. The garage was on fire. I was out of bed before my brain fully processed what he'd said. Clothes, keys, shoes. The sequence happened on autopilot while my father's voice kept crackling through the phone speaker, now lying on my unmade bed as I rushed around the apartment. He was saying something about fire trucks and neighbors and how fast it had spread. His words came in gasps, like he'd been running or couldn't catch his breath. I told him I was coming, told him to get everyone outside and away from the structure, told him things I'd learned from some safety training video I'd watched years ago that I didn't even remember watching. Then I hung up and ran. The drive from my apartment to my father's house normally took about 25 minutes. I made it in 16. The streets were empty at that hour, just yellow traffic lights blinking caution at intersections where nobody was crossing. My truck's engine roared louder than it should have, or maybe that was just my perception, everything amplified by adrenaline. I could smell the smoke before I even turned onto the street. That specific scent of burning wood and chemicals, and everything that shouldn't be on fire, suddenly being on fire. It hung in the air like a physical presence, getting thicker as I got closer. The fire trucks were already there when I arrived, their red and white lights painting the neighborhood in alternating colors that made everything look like a nightmare disco. Neighbors stood on their lawns in bathrobes and jackets thrown over pajamas, holding their phones up to record the spectacle, because that's what people do now. Document everything. Share everything. Turn tragedy into content. I parked half on the curb and ran toward the house. The garage was a black silhouette against orange flames that licked up from the interior, like the building had opened its mouth to scream. Firefighters were already blasting it with water from thick hoses that writhed like serpents in their grips. Steam and smoke billowed up into the night sky, mixing with the water vapor to create a fog that smelled like hell's laundry. The garage door had either burned through or been broken down by the fire crew. Through the opening, I could see the flames that consumed everything. The workbench, the pegboard walls, the shelves full of carefully organized parts and supplies that Frank had accumulated over decades. And in the center of it all, surrounded by fire like some kind of demonic shrine, was the car. My father was standing on the front lawn with Karen and Kyle, all three of them wrapped in blankets that the EMTs had apparently provided. Nobody looked injured, just shocked and scared and very, very awake. I walked up to them, and my father's face crumpled when he saw me. He started to say something, but Karen cut him off immediately. She began talking before I was even fully stopped, her voice sharp and accusatory despite the blanket around her shoulders and the soot smudge on her forehead. She wanted me to know this was my fault. That old car, that fire hazard, that disaster waiting to happen had finally happened, and they were lucky to be alive. I looked past her toward the garage. The flames were starting to die down now under the assault of water and foam. The firefighters moved with practiced efficiency, professionals dealing with something they'd seen 100 times before. Kyle stood next to his mother, and something about his posture made me pause. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at his phone, but his thumb wasn't moving. The screen was dark. He was just holding it like a shield. I asked what happened, how the fire started. There was a pause that lasted too long. Karen jumped in again, saying they didn't know. Probably an electrical short, or maybe the space heater Frank used to keep the garage warm in winter. These old places, she said, they're tinder boxes. It was only a matter of time. But Kyle still wouldn't look at me. One of the firefighters, a woman with her face mask pushed up on her helmet, approached us and asked who owned the property. My father raised his hand like a kid in class. She told him the fire was contained, but the garage was a total loss. The house itself had some heat damage to the siding, but nothing structural. They'd gotten here fast enough to stop it from spreading. She asked if anyone knew what started it. Another pause. Then Kyle finally spoke, his voice quiet and defensive at the same time. He said he'd gone into the garage earlier, that evening, to grab something he'd left in there. One of his protein shaker bottles, or some other piece of his carefully curated lifestyle. He might have been smoking. He might have tossed a cigarette near some rags. He wasn't sure. It was dark. He hadn't thought it was a big deal. The firefighter's expression didn't change, but I could see the judgment in her eyes. She asked if he understood that improperly disposed cigarettes were one of the leading causes of structure fires. Kyle shrugged, actually shrugged. The firefighter wrote something on her clipboard and walked back toward her crew. They were wrapping up now, rolling hoses, checking for hot spots that might reignite. I stood there on the lawn, watching smoke pour out of what used to be Frank's workshop, and felt something cold settle in my chest. This kid had burned down my grandfather's garage because he was too lazy to walk outside to smoke, because he couldn't be bothered to properly extinguish a cigarette, because the universe had handed him every advantage, and he still somehow managed to be careless with it, and nobody was going to do anything about it. Karen was already pivoting the narrative in real time, talking about how grateful they were that nobody was hurt, how material things could be replaced, how this was really just a blessing in disguise, because now they could finally renovate that outdated structure into something modern. I wanted to scream, wanted to grab Kyle by his expensive shirt and shake him until some sense of responsibility fell out. Wanted to make my father look at me, actually look at me, and acknowledge what was happening here. But I didn't do any of those things. I just stood there as the sun started to think about rising, turning the sky from black to navy to a sickly gray that matched the smoke still drifting from the ruined garage. The fire trucks eventually left. The neighbors went back inside. The show was over. We stood there in the driveway, the four of us, with nothing left to say. Karen told me to go home, said they'd handle the insurance and cleanup, and I should just stay away for a few days while they dealt with the mess. I looked at my father. He wouldn't meet my eyes either. Like father, like stepson. I left, drove back to my apartment as the sun came up over the city, turning all the glass buildings into mirrors of fire that made me think about garages burning and memories being erased. I called in sick to work, sat on my couch, stared at the wall. Then, around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Karen. She needed me to come back to the house. There were things we needed to discuss. I arrived to find the garage in daylight, and somehow it looked worse than it had in the dark with flames coming out of it. The structure was still standing, barely. The walls were blackened and warped. The roof had partially collapsed in the center. Everything that had been inside was now just charcoal and ash and twisted metal. The car sat in the middle of it all like a burned sacrifice. The bed liner coating that had made it look so ugly before had been transformed by fire into something worse. The rubber had charred and cracked, peeling away in thick strips that hung off the body like dead skin. What remained was bubbled and melted, exposing patches of whatever was underneath. The interior was completely gone. The seats had burned down to their metal frames. The steering wheel was a warped circle of scorched plastic. The dashboard had melted into an unrecognizable blob. Only the engine looked relatively intact, though it was covered in soot and would probably never run again without a complete rebuild. It looked like a skeleton, like something that had been buried, and then dug up and then set on fire for good measure. Karen was waiting for me on the front porch, dressed in what I'd come to recognize as her business casual armor. Pressed slacks, a blouse that probably cost more than my monthly insurance payment, Hair and makeup perfect despite everything that had happened 12 hours ago. Kyle wasn't visible, probably sleeping off the guilt he didn't actually feel. My father was there, though, sitting on the porch steps, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Older, defeated. Karen didn't waste time with small talk. She had a document in her hand, multiple pages printed on official-looking paper with lots of bold text and signature lines. She explained that the situation was complicated, that while Kyle had made a mistake, the real issue was that the car itself had been a fire hazard all along. Old fuel, old wiring, a disaster waiting to happen that I had insisted on leaving there despite their very reasonable concerns. I started to respond, but she held up her hand. She continued, saying their insurance company was going to ask a lot of questions. Questions about liability and negligence, and who was responsible for what. Her lawyer had advised her that the cleanest solution for everyone involved was for me to take possession of the damaged vehicle and sign a release. She handed me the papers. The document was titled Quitclaim and Release of Liability. Legal language filled the pages, but the basic message was clear. I would take ownership of the burned car, acknowledge it was my property, and release them from any and all claims related to its condition or the fire. In exchange, they would graciously decline to pursue legal action against me for the damages the car had allegedly caused. They were also appraising the burned vehicle's value at $0. Scrap metal. Worthless junk. The document went further. It included language about me releasing any and all claims to Frank's estate, including the house and any other assets. By signing, I'd be confirming that I'd received my full inheritance, which consisted solely of the garage contents that I was now being forced to haul away. It was elegant in a vicious kind of way. They were using their own son's negligence to steal everything and make it look like I was the problem. I looked at my father. He was staring at his shoes. I asked him if he understood what was happening here, if he saw how completely Karen was manipulating the situation, if he had any intention of standing up for his own father's memory or his own son's rights. He said very quietly that maybe this was for the best, that fighting would just make everything worse, that family was supposed to be more important than things. Karen smiled, not a warm smile, a winning smile. Kyle emerged from the house then, probably drawn by the sound of voices. He looked rough, hungover, or sleep-deprived, or both. He had a protein shake in one hand and his phone in the other, the essential tools of his trade. He glanced at the burned garage, made a face, and asked if I was fine to haul away that piece of junk so they could get the insurance payout and rebuild. Something in his tone, the casual dismissiveness, the complete absence of responsibility or remorse, the way he slurped his shake while looking at the ashes of something that had mattered. That's when I made my decision. I looked at the document in my hands. Read through it again, slower this time, making sure I understood exactly what I was signing. It was a trap, obviously, a legal maneuver designed to rob me while making me complicit in my own robbery. But something occurred to me as I read. This document established, in writing, that the car was worthless. $0. Burned scrap. They were making me acknowledge it was destroyed beyond any possible value. They were putting their contempt on paper. They were creating evidence of their own judgment. I asked if they had a pen. Karen produced one from her pocket immediately, like she'd been waiting for this moment. Probably had been. This was what she did, after all, manipulated situations. Moved pieces around the board. One. I took the pen. My father looked up at me, hope flickering in his eyes. Hope that I'd refuse. Hope that I'd fight. Hope that someone would finally push back against a woman who'd colonized his life. But I didn't refuse. I signed every page where indicated, initialed every section that required initials, made my signature clear and legible so there could be no question about my intent. Karen looked pleased. Kyle went back to his phone. My father's shoulders slumped. I handed the papers back to Karen and told her that I'd have the car removed within 24 hours. That after that, I never wanted to see any of them again. That this was the price of making them permanently disappear from my life, and I was willing to pay it. She said that was very mature of me, very reasonable. I wanted to laugh. or scream, or set something else on fire just to watch it burn. Instead, I walked away, pulled out my phone, and called Danny. He arrived 3 hours later with his flatbed truck, looking at the burned garage and whistling low through his teeth. He asked what happened, and I gave him the short version. Fire, negligence, family drama. He nodded like he'd heard it all before, because he probably had. Danny had been in the towing business for 15 years. He'd seen every type of disaster and dysfunction humanity had to offer. We assessed the car together. It was still structurally intact enough to load onto the flatbed, though we'd have to be careful. The burned bedliner was unstable, pieces of it falling off as we positioned the chains. The smell was overwhelming. Burned rubber and plastic and upholstery and oil all mixed together into a stench that made my eyes water. It would probably never fully leave the car's body, absorbed into the metal itself like smoke in a firefighter's jacket. Danny's truck had a hydraulic bed that tilted down to create a ramp. We positioned it carefully behind the car and used the winch cable to drag the burned hulk up onto the platform. It made horrible scraping sounds as it moved, the destroyed tires leaving black smears on the metal ramp. Once it was secured, Danny raised the bed back to level and locked everything down with additional chains. The car sat there on his flatbed like a funeral display, a charred monument to carelessness and family betrayal. Karen and Kyle watched from the porch. My father had gone inside. He couldn't even watch this final indignity. I climbed into the passenger seat of Danny's truck. He asked where we were taking it, and I realized I didn't have an answer ready. My apartment wouldn't work. Miller's Customs was closed on Sundays, and I hadn't cleared any of this with my boss yet. I didn't have any other properties or connections that would make sense. Danny suggested a storage yard. He had space in the back where he kept vehicles waiting for auction or parts processing. He could let me stash it there for a while, at least until I figure out what to do with it. I told him that would work. Asked him what I owed him for the tow and the storage. He waved me off, said this one was on the house. Friends help friends, especially when family turns to garbage. We drove through town with a burned car on display behind us. People stared at traffic lights. Kids pointed from back seats. An old man taking his dog for a walk stopped on the sidewalk to watch us pass, shaking his head. It looked like we were hauling away evidence from a crime scene, which, in a way, we were. Danny's storage yard was on the industrial side of town, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. He parked near the back, in a section where several other vehicles sat in various states of disrepair. A minivan with no wheels. A sedan crushed in on one side from an accident. A pickup truck that looked like it had been used as target practice. We unloaded the car using the same process in reverse, winching it down the tilted bed until it sat on bare ground among the other automotive casualties. In the daylight, away from the burned garage and Karen's poisonous presence, I could finally look at it clearly. The fire had done catastrophic damage. The bedliner coating was destroyed, cracked and peeling and bubbled. The interior was gone completely. The engine was probably seized. The wiring was melted. The fuel system was compromised. By any reasonable measure, this was scrap, worthless metal, something that should be crushed and melted down for raw materials. I had signed a legal document confirming that assessment, had put my name on paper agreeing that this burned hulk was valued at exactly $0. And yet, as I stood there looking at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd won something. That by taking this destroyed thing, by accepting it as mine, I'd somehow gotten the better end of this deal. Maybe it was just stubborn pride. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was grief expressing itself in weird ways. Or maybe it was something Frank had taught me years ago about looking past the surface to see what was really there. Danny put his hand on my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I told him I didn't know yet. He said that was fair, that I should take my time, figure things out, and call him if I needed anything else. Then he drove away, leaving me alone in a storage yard full of broken vehicles under a gray sky that threatened rain but couldn't quite commit. I walked around the burned car one more time, examining it from every angle. Under the destroyed bed liner, in the spots where fire had burned hot enough to crack through the thick rubber coating completely, I could see glimpses of what was underneath. I had expected fiberglass. Cheap, cracked, dollar store body material that justified all those years of leaving the bedliner in place. But what I saw in those few exposed patches didn't look like fiberglass. It looked like metal. Clean, smooth, unmarked by the fire that had raged around it. I touched one of the exposed sections, felt the cool surface under my fingertips. Then I stopped myself, pulled my hand back. I didn't know what I was looking at, didn't know what it meant, didn't know if it mattered. All I knew for certain was that I owned a burned car that everyone agreed was worthless, and I'd signed my name to that fact in a legally binding document that my stepmother probably already had filed in triplicate. I locked the storage yard gate behind me and drove home through Sunday afternoon traffic, thinking about fires and family and the weird things we do to protect memories. The car sat in Danny's yard, waiting for whatever came next. I had no idea that everything was about to change. No idea at all. I waited 3 days before I went back to look at the car. 3 days of going through the motions at Miller's Customs, changing oil and rotating tires, and replacing brake pads while my brain ran in circles about what I glimpsed under that burned bedliner. Metal where there should have been fiberglass. Clean where there should have been damage. On the 4th day, I couldn't stand it anymore. I asked my boss, Mr. Miller, if I could use the shop's bay after hours to assess some personal property. He's 60 years old, been running Miller's Customs since before I was born, with hands that look like they've been carved from oak and a bullshit detector calibrated to surgical precision. He asked what kind of personal property, required shop space. I told him about the car, about Frank, about the fire and the family drama, and the burn hulk currently sitting in Danny's storage yard. Miller listened without interrupting, which is one of his superpowers. When I finished, he just nodded and said I could use Bay 3 and whatever tools I needed. Then he added that he'd stick around to help if I wanted a second set of eyes on whatever I found. That's the thing about good people. They don't make you beg for help. They just show up. We had Danny bring the car over on his flatbed that evening, right as the sun was starting to set, and paint the sky in those orange and purple colors that make everything look either beautiful or apocalyptic, depending on your mood. The burned Cobra, if that's what it actually was, rolled down the ramp and into Bay 3 like a patient being wheeled into surgery. Miller circled it slowly, hands in his pockets, making those small humming sounds that meant his brain was processing information faster than his mouth could articulate. He finally said it was a shame about Frank's work getting destroyed, but at least the block looked salvageable. Maybe we could strip it for parts. V8 engines always had value to somebody. Then he asked me what I wanted to do with it. I didn't have a good answer. I just knew I needed to see what was under that bedliner. Needed to confirm what I glimpsed in Danny's yard wasn't just wishful thinking or stress-induced hallucination. I grabbed a hammer from the tool wall. A regular carpenter's hammer. Nothing fancy. Miller raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. I positioned myself next to the front fender, where the bedliner had cracked worse during the fire. The rubber coating hung in thick, peeling strips like burned skin. It looked diseased. Terminal. I raised a hammer and brought it down on the fender with more force than was probably necessary. The sound it made wasn't right. When you hit fiberglass, it cracks, splinters, makes a hollow, brittle sound like breaking a plastic bucket. When you hit thin metal, it dents with a soft thud that you feel in the hammer handle. This didn't sound like either of those things. This sounded solid, dense, like hitting a church bell that had been wrapped in rubber. A chunk of the burned bedliner broke away under the impact, falling to the floor in pieces that looked like charred bark from a diseased tree. Underneath, exposed to the fluorescent shop lights for the first time in probably 40 years, was metal, not fiberglass, not cheap steel. Metal that gleamed silver even under the soot and residue from the fire. Miller moved closer. He wasn't humming anymore. I hit the fender again. Another chunk of bedliner fell away. More silver metal underneath, smooth and unblemished. Miller held up his hand for me to stop. He moved in close, running his fingers over the exposed section. His expression had changed from curious to focused, the look he got when he was working on something that didn't make sense, and he needed to understand why. He said something I didn't expect. He said if this was fiberglass like we'd thought, the fire would have melted it. Fiberglass resin turns to liquid around 400 degrees. The bedliner would burn away and left nothing but puddles of melted plastic, an exposed wooden frame. And if it was steel, the kind you'd find on any normal car body, it would have turned blue from the heat, would have warped, would have rusted immediately once the fire department soaked everything with water. But this metal looked factory fresh. He pulled out a pocket knife and scraped gently at the surface, removing a thin layer of soot. The metal underneath gleamed. He examined the shaving that had come off, rubbed it between his fingers, brought it close to his face to inspect. Then he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before, something between shock and reverence. He said it was aluminum, aircraft-grade aluminum. I didn't understand at first. Aluminum was for airplanes and soda cans, not cars, especially not kit cars from the 80s that Frank had bought from some shady seller for pocket change. Miller explained it like he was talking to himself, working through the logic out loud. The thick bedliner coating had acted like a thermal barrier, like the heat shield on a space shuttle. It had burned and charred and melted on the outside, but in doing so it had absorbed the heat and protected what was underneath. The fire that should have destroyed this car had actually preserved it. He said we needed to find the VIN, the vehicle identification number, that would tell us what this thing actually was. We spent the next hour carefully removing more of the burned bed liner, working section by section to expose the body underneath. Miller worked with the precision of an archaeologist uncovering something fragile and precious. I worked with the desperate energy of someone who'd started to suspect they'd been sitting on buried treasure, while everyone called it trash. The aluminum body revealed itself piece by piece, curves and lines that spoke of a designer's vision rather than a kit car manufacturer's convenience. The proportions were right in a way that was hard to articulate, but impossible to miss once you saw it. This wasn't a replica. This wasn't someone's weekend project gone wrong. This was something else entirely. Miller directed me to the frame rail on the driver's side, near where the door would have been if this car had actual doors. He said that's where manufacturers stamped their identification numbers in the 60s, back before regulations standardized everything. I used a wire brush to clean away decades of grime and soot from that section of the frame. The metal was cold under my hands, solid and real, and refusing to be anything other than exactly what it was. And there, stamped into the aluminum frame in numbers and letters that had survived 40 years of hiding and one night of fire, was a code. CSX 2467. Miller went completely still. He stared at those numbers like they were written in a language only he could read. Then he pulled out his phone and started typing, his thick fingers moving across the screen with surprising speed. I asked him what CSX meant. He didn't answer immediately. He was scrolling through something, reading with intensity that made the air in the shop feel heavier. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere outside, a car alarm went off and then stopped. Finally, Miller lowered his phone and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts congratulations and condolences. He said CSX was the chassis code for original Shelby Cobras. The real ones. The ones Carroll Shelby built in the 60s by stuffing massive Ford the Fifth 8 engines into lightweight British roadster bodies. He said only about 300 were ever made. He said they were worth more than most people's houses. The world tilted slightly. I looked at the burned, stripped, destroyed things sitting in Bay 3 and tried to reconcile what Miller was saying with what I was seeing. This couldn't be a real Cobra. Real Cobras were in museums and private collections and climate-controlled garages owned by people who had more money than sense. Real Cobras didn't get bought at shady sales in the 80s and covered in truck bed liner and left to sit in suburban garages, while the owner's grandson learned to change oil. Miller continued reading from his phone. He'd found a registry, apparently, a database that tracked every known Cobra by its CSX number. He scrolled until he found 2467. The entry said the car had been reported missing in 1982. Suspected stolen. Last known location was a storage facility in Nevada. The owner had filed an insurance claim, and it had been written off as a loss. And somehow, through some chain of events that we'd probably never fully understand, Frank had ended up with it. I sat down on the concrete floor. Because my legs forgot how to hold me up, Miller kept talking, explaining how Frank must have bought it from whoever stole it, probably not knowing what it was. How the thief or fence or whoever had probably covered it in bed liner to disguise it, make it unrecognizable. How Frank had believed the cover story about it being a kit car, because why wouldn't he? And how he'd been about to strip it for parts, about to send a piece of automotive history to the scrapyard, because we thought it was junk. The fire had saved it. The same fire that Kyle's negligence had started. The same fire that had given Karen the ammunition she needed to legally steal it from me. That fire had burned away just enough of the disguise to reveal what was hidden underneath. Miller asked me what I wanted to do. It was a bigger question than it sounded like. What I wanted to do with a potentially $1 million car that everyone believed was worthless, that I'd signed legal documents claiming was worthless, that my stepmother thought she'd successfully stolen from me while making it look like charity. I thought about Frank, about his philosophy that things have souls if you put your hands into them, about how he'd worked on this car for years, never knowing what it really was, just knowing it deserved better than abandonment. I told Miller I wanted to restore it, properly, the way it deserved. He nodded slowly, then said that kind of restoration would take time. Money. Expertise beyond what either of us had. We'd need specialists, parts, documentation. Then he said he wanted to be part of it, that his shop could be the base of operations, and he'd contribute his time and space in exchange for a percentage when we eventually sold it. Partnership, not charity, not pity. Business between equals who both understood what we were looking at. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, honest. We stood there in Bay 3, looking at the burned skeleton of a car that had been hiding in plain sight for 4 decades, and I felt something shift in my chest. Something that had been heavy since Frank died and gotten heavier since the fire. Purpose. That's what it was. Suddenly, I had a purpose that extended beyond just honoring a memory. I was going to bring this thing back from the dead. And in doing so, I was going to prove something to Karen and Kyle and my father and everyone else who'd written me off as a family disappointment covered in grease. I was going to prove that value isn't always obvious. That treasures can look like trash if you don't know how to see. That sometimes the thing everyone else wants to throw away is exactly the thing worth saving. The restoration took 14 months. 14 months of working every evening and weekend, of tracking down parts from collectors and specialists across 3 continents, of learning skills I didn't have and making mistakes that cost time and money and pride. Miller kept the car in Bay 3, covered with a tarp when we weren't actively working on it. His other mechanics knew something was happening, but respected the silence we maintained. This was our project. Our secret. We rebuilt the engine completely. The V8 had survived the fire better than expected, but every component needed inspection and most needed replacement. Pistons, bearings, gaskets, the camshaft. Each part was sourced carefully, verified for authenticity, installed with the kind of attention usually reserved for surgical procedures. The aluminum body required specialists. We found a guy in California who'd worked on vintage Cobras before, flew him out twice to consult, and guide us through the process of repairing fire damage without compromising the original metal. Every panel had to be carefully assessed. Some could be saved. Some had to be replaced with period-correct aluminum that cost more per square inch than gold. The interior was rebuilt from photographs of other 427 Cobras from the same year. Leather seats, original-style gauges, a steering wheel that matched the factory specifications down to the diameter and grip texture. We painted it Viking blue, which according to the registry had been its original color. The paint job alone took 3 weeks and cost enough to make me wake up at night questioning my sanity. But watching that blue come to life under the clear coat, seeing the body lines that had been hidden under bedliner for 40 years finally revealed in their intended glory, that made every dollar an hour worth it. It was beautiful. Legitimately, objectively beautiful in a way that made people stop and stare. We'd taken a burned wreck that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard and transformed it into something that belonged in a museum. Miller suggested we contact Pebble Beach. The Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance, one of the most prestigious automotive events in the world, where collectors brought their finest vehicles to compete for awards and, occasionally, to offer them at auction. He had contacts there from his years in the business. He made calls, sent documentation, photos, the story of the car's discovery and restoration. They accepted us, wanted the car for their auction, said the story alone would generate interest, but the quality of the restoration would seal the deal. We transported it to California in a climate-controlled truck. The car strapped down like it was made of spider webs and wishes. Miller and I both went, neither of us willing to let it out of our sight. The auction was on a Saturday in August, under skies so blue it looked fake. The kind of day where everything feels possible because nature itself is showing off. The car sat on a rotating platform in a pavilion full of people who wore watches worth more than my truck and spoke casually about six-figure purchases like normal humans talk about groceries. Miller and I stood at the back, wearing the only suits we owned, feeling like mechanics at a wedding. The auctioneer introduced our Cobra, told its story, the disappearance in 1982, the decades hidden under bedliner, the fire that revealed it, the 14-month restoration that brought it back to life. The crowd murmured. Phones came out. People in the front rows leaned forward. The bidding started at $500,000. It climbed fast. 600, 750, 800. Numbers that stopped sounding real, that became abstract concepts rather than actual money someone might pay for a car. Miller grabbed my arm. His grip was tight enough to hurt. 1 million, 1.2, 1.5. The auctioneer's voice rose and fell in that practiced rhythm, calling out bids, acknowledging paddles, keeping the momentum building. 2 million, 3 million, 4 million. I couldn't breathe properly. The pavilion felt too hot and too cold at the same time. This couldn't be happening. This was happening. 5 million, 6 million, 7 million. The bids came slower now, the serious players emerging from the crowd. Old money, new money, investment groups seeing an opportunity. 8 million, 9 million, 10 million. Miller was saying something next to me, but I couldn't hear him over the blood rushing in my ears. I watched the auctioneer point to different sections of the crowd, watched paddles rise and fall, watched numbers on the screen climb higher than I'd ever imagined possible. 11 million, 12 million, 13 million. The bidding slowed. 2 players left now, both unseen somewhere in the crowd. Titans negotiating in increments of hundreds of thousands like it was pocket change. 14 million, 14.5, 15 million. The auctioneer called for 15.5. Waited. Called again. No response. Going once. Going twice. The hammer fell. $15.2 million. For a car that Karen had legally established was worth $0, that she'd forced me to take as worthless garbage. That Kyle had nearly destroyed through careless negligence. I don't remember much about the rest of that day. There were papers to sign and people to shake hands with and champagne that tasted like expensive regret for anyone betting against us. Miller and I split the proceeds according to our agreement. Even after his cut and the auction house fees and the cost of restoration and a significant chunk set aside for taxes, I was looking at more money than I'd ever imagined having. More money than most people would see in 3 lifetimes of work. We flew home the next day, neither of us quite able to process what had happened. On the plane, Miller asked me what I was going to do now. I said I didn't know yet. Asked him the same question. He said he was going to buy his wife that trip to Italy she'd been wanting for 30 years and maybe upgrade some equipment at the shop. Then he asked if I'd thought about what Karen and Kyle would do when they found out. I hadn't actually. In all the chaos of restoration and preparation and auction, I'd somehow forgotten that they existed, that they'd made this possible through their greed and negligence and absolute certainty that they were smarter than everyone else. They found out 2 days later when the automotive press picked up the story. $1 million barn find. Fire-damaged Cobra restored to glory. Record-breaking auction price. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m. Unknown numbers. I ignored them. Then Kyle started texting, demanding I call him, saying we needed to talk, using words like lawyer and fraud and consequences. I blocked his number. Then Karen's when she started doing the same thing. But blocking numbers doesn't stop lawsuits, and they filed one within the week. The legal document was impressive in its delusion. They claimed I defrauded them, that I'd known the car was valuable when I signed the quitclaim, that I'd taken advantage of their generosity and trust, that the proceeds from the sale rightfully belonged to Frank's estate, which meant my father, which meant Karen since he controlled everything he did. They were demanding the full $15.2 million plus damages plus legal fees. They'd hired a firm from the city, the kind with marble lobbies and lawyers who bill like they're selling diamonds by the hour. My lawyer, a woman named Sarah Chun who Miller recommended, read through the complaint and actually laughed out loud in her office. She asked if I still had the quitclaim document, the one where they'd established the car was worthless, and forced me to take it. I did. I'd kept everything. Every text message, every email, every piece of paper from that nightmare day after the fire. Sarah smiled the way sharks smile when they smell blood in the water. She said we'd be fine. Better than fine. But the legal process took time, and during that time, Karen and Kyle apparently made some interesting decisions. They'd mortgaged my father's house, actually went to a bank and took out a massive loan against the property, using the expected lawsuit proceeds as justification for why they'd be able to pay it back. They'd hired that expensive law firm on contingency, but with significant upfront costs that they'd pay by maxing out credit cards and taking personal loans. Kyle had apparently started spending money he didn't have yet, booking luxury vacations and buying a new car and acting like the lawsuit was already won. They'd gone all in on their certainty that they'd win, that the legal system would see things their way, that I'd be forced to hand over the money that should have been theirs all along. Sarah told me this with the kind of professional neutrality that lawyers cultivate, but I could see the amusement in her eyes. They'd bet everything on being right, on me being wrong, on the universe rewarding their version of reality. The court date arrived on a Tuesday in October, one of those fall days where the air smells like dead leaves and possibilities. The courthouse was downtown, all stone and marble, and the way to justice, or at least the appearance of it. Karen and Kyle sat on one side with their legal team. 3 lawyers in suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to. I sat on the other side with Sarah, who wore a simple gray suit and carried a single folder. The judge was a woman in her 50s who looked like she'd heard every excuse and seen every scheme and wasn't impressed by any of it anymore. Karen's lead attorney stood and delivered an opening statement that painted me as a manipulative opportunist who'd taken advantage of a grieving family in their moment of vulnerability. He talked about Frank's legacy and family obligations and the spirit of inheritance law. It was compelling. If I hadn't lived through the actual events, I might have believed it myself. Then Sarah stood up. She didn't give a long speech. She didn't need to. She walked to the judge's bench and handed over a document, the quitclaim, the one Karen had shoved at me on that terrible morning after the fire. She pointed out several key sections. The part where the car was assessed at $0. The part where they demanded I remove it immediately. The part where they'd threatened to sue me for damages if I didn't sign. She noted that they'd forced this agreement on me while I was in shock and grief, using the threat of legal action to coerce my signature. She pointed out that their current lawsuit contradicted their own legal document. They'd established, under penalty of perjury, that the car was worthless. They demanded I take it. They'd made me sign away any claims to Frank's estate in exchange for removing what they called hazardous waste. The judge read through the quitclaim carefully. Asked Karen's attorney if he'd seen this document before filing the lawsuit. He had. He'd based part of his case on it, arguing I'd signed under duress and that the agreement was invalid. Sarah countered that if the agreement was invalid due to duress, then Karen and Kyle had coerced a legal document through threats, which was itself illegal. If the agreement was valid, then they'd already established the car was worthless when it left their property, which meant any subsequent value came from my work and expertise, not their ownership. Either way, she argued, they had no claim to the proceeds. The judge asked Karen's attorney if he had any response. He tried, talked about equity and fairness, and how the law should consider the spirit of situations, not just a letter. The judge cut him off, said the law was exactly the letter of agreements people sign. That Karen and Kyle had created a legal document establishing their position, that they couldn't now claim the opposite just because the outcome wasn't what they'd expected. She ruled in my favor. Complete dismissal of their case. No damages. No proceeds shared. Nothing. Karen made a sound in the courtroom that might have been a scream if she'd had enough air in her lungs to complete it. Kyle's face went through several colors, none of them healthy. Their lead attorney started talking about appeals, but the judge said he was welcome to pursue that if he wanted to waste more of his client's money on a case with no legal merit. Sarah and I walked out of that courthouse into the October afternoon, and I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I'd won money. The money was almost abstract at this point, numbers in an account that didn't quite feel real. But because the universe had finally, definitively, said that Karen and Kyle were wrong, that their cruelty didn't get rewarded, that their certainty wasn't the same as correctness. I found out later, through channels I'm not proud of using but won't apologize for, what happened to them after the lawsuit failed. The mortgage they'd taken on the house came due. They couldn't pay it. The bank foreclosed. My father, who'd been a silent ghost through all of this, finally found enough spine to file for divorce. Karen fought it, but she was fighting from a position of no leverage and no money. Kyle's debts caught up with him. The credit cards, the personal loans, the car he couldn't afford. He had to declare bankruptcy at 21 years old. His credit destroyed before he'd even really started his life. They'd gambled everything on being right about me being wrong, and they'd lost it all. I wish I could say I felt bad for them. I don't. I used part of the money to buy a building on the edge of town, converted it into my own custom shop, hired 2 mechanics I'd worked with before, kept Miller on as a consultant because I'm not stupid enough to think I know everything. I kept my apartment, kept my truck, kept my habits of working with my hands and coming home tired, and eating dinner standing at the counter like I always had. The money changed what I could do, but it didn't change who I was. Frank would have been pleased about that, I think. I drove out to his grave on a Sunday afternoon in late November. The cemetery was quiet, just wind moving through bare trees and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. His headstone was simple. Name, dates, military service. Nothing flowery. He would have hated anything flowery. I stood there for a while, hands in my pockets, looking at the carved granite and thinking about everything that had happened since I'd last been here. I told him we'd found his secret, that the ugly black car in his garage had been a treasure all along, that he'd probably known or suspected or chosen not to know because knowing would have complicated everything. I told him we'd restored it, that it had sold for enough money to change my life, that Karen and Kyle had tried to steal it and failed spectacularly. I told him I'd learned what he'd been trying to teach me all those years in the garage. That value isn't always obvious. That the things worth saving often look like they're not. That if you put your hands into something and do the work, it becomes part of you regardless of what anyone else thinks. The wind picked up, moving through the cemetery with a sound like distant conversation. I looked up at the sky. Gray clouds moving fast, the kind that might drop rain, or might just threaten. I said thank you, out loud, to a gravestone and the memory of a man who'd been harder than he needed to be and kinder than anyone knew. Thank you for teaching me to look under the surface. Thank you for leaving me something that everyone else thought was worthless. Thank you for being exactly who you were. No apologies, no compromises. Then I walked back to my truck and drove home through the November afternoon, past the building that now had my name on it, past the life I'd built with my own hands and the unexpected gift of a car that had been hiding its true nature for 40 years. The world kept turning. Work kept calling. Tomorrow would bring new problems and new opportunities and new chances to prove what I was worth. But today I just drove. Hands on the wheel. Radio playing something I didn't recognize. Free. That's the thing about treasure. Sometimes it's buried. Sometimes it's burned. Sometimes it's covered in rubber and hidden in plain sight while everyone laughs at it. But if you're patient enough, if you're willing to do the work, if you can see past what everyone else sees, sometimes you find that the thing everyone wanted to throw away was exactly what you needed to save. Frank knew that, lived it, taught it without ever saying it directly. And in the end, the lesson came through loud and clear, louder than any words could have made it. Look deeper. Work harder. Trust your hands. The rest will follow.